Gilberto is a crime prevention and criminal justice officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, headquartered in Vienna, Austria. He joined UNODC in 2010 and currently leads the secondary level of the Education for Justice E4J initiative, which seeks to produce and disseminate education material on justice and rule of law issues. And the title of our discussion today is Education for Justice. And I think for me, and I think for so many people around the world, justice has been a very big term that has been resonating in our minds, in our conversations all of last year, because COVID has really brought to light a lot of the deep-seated inequalities in society and all the resulting ramifications of it. So, Gilberto, welcome. And let's start off by understanding how you define justice.
Well, thank you very much for that question, Tara. We often hear the word and don't really think about what it means. And at least for us at the United Nations, we've developed over the year a series of standardized approaches to certain concepts. Justice for us, and this dates back to a definition that was created in 2004 under the then Secretary General Kofi Annan, where justice is more linked to processes of addressing grievances and correcting wrongdoing. So at least for the United Nations, justice is very much linked to the process of righting wrongs within societies and within the governmental and state institutions that exist for that purpose. Broader than that, we also work under the concept of the rule of law, which is also equally broad. And while we often hear about it, again, the definition is often quite elusive. And the rule of law is actually much broader in the sense that it's a principle of governance, very much related to accountability as well as human rights, ensuring that everyone, people, institutions, the state, are all accountable to laws that are developed in a fair and just process. So it's rule of law is even broader than justice in that sense.
And I think in the US, we saw that last year, and we'll continue to with the Black Lives Matter protests, and we'll get into that shortly. So in your work, how have you seen underrepresented youth talk about justice or the lack of justice for them?
This is a great question because young people in general experience injustice and challenges to the rule of law in very unique ways. What some people go through in a country, especially young people, is not necessarily what young people in other countries will relate to. Especially because underrepresentation or vulnerabilities or belonging to a minority looks very different depending on where we're talking about. But generally, through our collective experience in the Education for Justice initiative, we've learned that young people are very, very aware of of injustices that go on around them, and especially teenagers, because not children, but at the same time not adults. They're very keen to do something about it and become more engaged and learn more about these different aspects of injustice, specifically with underrepresented or minority young people. Their experiences very much shape the way with which they deal with public institutions, especially trust in public institutions and the state itself. So this is definitely something that we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, and I think when I first learned about the Education for Justice initiative, my mind was blown, because I think I have like the traditional viewpoint of the rule of law, police, and my role as an individual, and that as a citizen, I cannot really do much, or it's not my job. And so learning about the justice accelerators and the work you're doing to empower the public, especially youth, to think that they have ownership in this space right away is a completely different way of looking at the world. So what does success look like for you? What are you aiming for? And what if these youth do not live in a democratic country?
Well, let me just begin by saying that the Education for Justice Initiative and the global program under which we are housed, which this is a global program set up by UNODC to implement key aspects of the Doha Declaration, which was the outcome document of the 13th UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which happens every 5 years. The last Congress in 2015 was held in Doha, Qatar, and the Doha Declaration came up with a series of principles and commitments from member states, including the empowerment of youth to promote the rule of law, as well as commitments to integrate aspects of crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law into education systems. So we have been implementing this for a number of years now. And one of our engagement with technology has represented a core aspect of that. In fact, the Justice Accelerators has been the latest development that we have had, and it's rooted in the fact that we need to also foster the interest that young people might have in STEM, and let them know that with STEM skills, they can promote the rule of law as well, and that will be very helpful. So the Justice Accelerators does a little bit of that. It's actually been a culmination of a series of hackathons that we have done over the past few years. You are now actually seeing some of the pictures of the last in-person event that we had before the pandemic, which was done in partnership with Africa Teen Geeks, which is a great South African NGO.
Gilberto, you need to move the slide, I think.
Yes.
There we go.
So this was from the last in-person event that we did in 2019. And we were able to, of course, again, over the years, understand that young people are really, really keen to talk about issues related to justice and the rule of law. They're all new to them in the way that they have become empowered to act. And it has been very interesting for us to see that evolution. So in another sense, the other aspect that I want to try to bring out is that based on this experience with hackathons, we developed the Justice Accelerators, which is a several-month-long program where we mentor teenagers with STEM skills to develop rule of law-focused projects, at the end of the period, they actually can apply for seed funding to further develop their projects. And we've been pilot testing that since August last year in 2 countries, in Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. And hopefully we will be able to launch new editions soon in the future when we make these adjustments. But the experience, and I think that the Justice Accelerators is actually what we want to identify as success, because it shows that young people with STEM skills can become really interested and empowered once they see that they can use those skills to promote the rule of law. And working on justice and the rule of law is not necessarily just for police, lawyers, prosecutors, or judges, but people who become accountants, engineers, other different scientists, IT experts can put together very interesting tech tools to promote the rule of law.
And that's the power of technology, right? And a sense of agency. So each year, Technovation Girls creates solutions to tackle issues of justice, which is heartrending sometimes, because you are thinking that these young people, young girls are experiencing these issues, but also so inspiring because they're like, okay, I'm going to try to tackle this. So issues of police brutality, racial injustices. What support should educational organizations give to such brave young people who are standing up to very powerful institutions, sometimes even their own families, to fight for justice?
The number one element I think needs to be considered by educational institutions is try to look at what is driving young people. They want to change something. They want to leave a mark. They want to make the world better, and they have the skills to develop a tech tool to do that. I think that many times, because educators may not necessarily understand either the issue at hand or the technology that might be behind it, they can become a little bit fearful. We are also generally concerned as adults about how students, especially underage students and young people, will deal with issues that sometimes in our minds are linked to security, things that might put others in danger. So I think that aside from understanding what is driving that, it's important for educators to provide helpful tips on how to be safe while doing that, how to think of potential implications, but in a way that doesn't scare off young people to the level where they drop that idea. Let me give you an example. One of the teams in the Justice Accelerators in Kyrgyzstan, where we did the pilot, was developing an application focusing on gender-based violence in schools and potentially how to create a mechanism to either collect information on signs of abuse, but also information that could be sent to potential authorities. And it was very interesting to see that some of the concerns that came up related to data privacy. So it was important to talk to that particular group about how they would ensure that their application did not go over the line in the sense where that they protect the privacy of those that they were targeting, which would be themselves underage. So there were numerous implications that could potentially be legal. In another case, a team developed an application to link legal aid providers with people in need of legal services and legal support. And they developed a platform that could link them both. And we also had to talk to them extensively about how they would create a disclaimer and avoid liability for themselves for issues that might happen between the two groups that they were linking. So all of this is something that we, as educators in general, can do to support young people. So it's trying to understand where they're coming from, what they are trying to tackle, what some of the unforeseen consequences may be, and how we can help them solve it and not necessarily solve it for them as well.
I think that's the heart of education, right? Like you're mentoring and supporting and keeping them safe. So I learned 3 terms around dissent at the UNDP 2020 Human Development Report, which was very interesting to me. And it talks about how young people, I mean, Greta Thunberg is the face of this powerful activism, but there are 3 types of dissent. One is dutiful dissent, where, and a community garden is an example where you are integrating activism into an existing system and structure. Another dissent is disruptive. And I think the Fridays for Future school strike is an example of disruptive dissent. And the third one is dangerous dissent, which is when you're coming up with a completely alternative new system. And I learned about the degrowth movement. All of this is new to me, but I was curious. Have you seen different types of youth activism in your work? And what are some, you already gave us 2 examples, but what are some other examples of effective activism you've seen?
Thank you for the question. I am not particularly familiar with that terminology from the latest Human Development Report, but I do think it's interesting to analyze some of the movements going on. through our experience, we have seen youth engaged in a wide variety of issues. I think that the easiest thing youth normally can do is awareness raising. Perhaps that's closer to Greta's movement. And within the awareness raising realm, we have, for example, supported a school program in Ethiopia where they came up with a whole set of events and ideas for a campaign on preventing human trafficking, in line with the UNODC Blue Heart campaign, which is our global campaign against human trafficking. So we provided support to them and mentoring, and they organized an event, an exhibit around that. And this is one kind of activity that we have seen. Another one, which is not an example from our program itself, but it's something that we have come across, is work on transparency and accountability. There is an organization that we have worked with over the course of EVRJ, which is called Integrity Action. In Palestine, they developed an integrity education program where schools worked with local governments, and students at the secondary level were actually undertaking oversight of local government expenditure. And they actually, through that program, were able to identify areas where resources, although having been allocated, were not being spent to deliver certain public services. And they worked together with local municipal governments to put those different areas of public work into place. So youth activism doesn't necessarily need to focus on awareness raising. There's a lot of action involved. And I think that this is also something that we need to see more of. I also want to raise the attention that sometimes the word activism can be perceived in a negative connotation, but we need to, as much as possible, try to focus on not, let me put it in a different way. We need to focus as much as we can on building bridges. I think that the example from Palestine is really interesting because bridges were established, young people worked with local governments, and just as much as an awareness raising campaign can also be done in partnership with different stakeholders. So I think that this is really important for young people as well.
That's an interesting point of view. I think I wonder if there's a natural stage in life for human beings, and young people have a rebellious streak, and so maybe they're not at the building bridges stage, but I think that is the way you make change in the world, right?
Correct.
So for the US specifically, I think, what is your advice for African American and Latinx youth who are experiencing even more injustices amplified due to COVID?
This is a very complex question, and before answering that, I really do need to emphasize that I am privileged in the sense that I have not suffered the kind of injustices that that some of these groups have been subject to, and not only in the United States, but also in different countries. When you have not been exposed to certain levels of injustice or prejudice, what I have come to realize is that listening is really important, because you don't go through it, but you hear people talk about it. And having benefited from knowing a variety of people who have been open about the levels of injustice to which they were subject, one of the things that I can clearly say is that talking about it is something that they should definitely do. I have benefited, for example, from listening to women talk about the different ways in which they have been discriminated against because of gender. And I hope that this has helped me see things differently, even though I haven't experienced that, and become more aware of how my behavior should change, how I should try to change other people's behavior as well. So for African American and Latinx girls and young women in the US, I think that talking about it is definitely important. Building bridges and partnerships so that you can advance the things that you want to fight for is really important. And one thing that you mentioned before, which is about certain situations where maybe the structures are not necessarily aligned with what we are doing. And I'm not necessarily talking about the United States, but sometimes we come across a government, legislative power, or other structures that don't necessarily agree with us. I think that it's important to understand that changing things takes time. Changing laws and making sure that the laws work for you takes time, and you need to be aware of the processes that exist, work with the processes that exist, and sometimes you also need to work with those players to change the existing processes. So it all takes time, and that's why supporting each other through partnerships, talking about it, making sure that you raise people's awareness to it is so important, especially so that people who haven't gone through what they have can open their eyes.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, building bridges, and then I think openness and patience, right? Like to have the patience to work with one another. So I think you talked about this earlier as well, like your advice for education organizations. But the question is a little bit more pointed now, where how can we better prepare youth for a COVID world, where there's so much data coming that the inequalities are going to be increased, and with inequality comes an idea of injustice as well. So what can education organizations specifically do to prepare students better?
I'm going to pick up something from a book that I read recently, that from an African Brazilian author. I'm Brazilian, and I thought that this book was particularly helpful to understand some of the racial inequality issues in Brazil. And one thing this author mentions in that book, her name is Jamila Ribeiro, is that when you are faced with so many structural issues, and different types of discrimination and inequality gaps, it's important to understand that you don't have to pick one. You need to work across the board to address all of them. And this, I think, is particularly important in the post-COVID world, because the education sector itself has been exposed to massive inequalities all over the world in terms of access to education, access to equipment to ensure the continuity of education, as well as skills on all sides, teachers, students alike. We also see lack of equal treatment, especially in receiving different governmental services in different places. Vaccines have reached many countries, but they have, more importantly, not reached many more countries than those that actually have access to vaccines. So I think that educators need to be aware that COVID-19 has exposed many different types of inequality, and that we need to tackle all of them. And the UN Secretary General actually has an entire campaign devoted to recovering better. And I think that recovering better, and you can also look at some of his speeches, is about tackling everything at once. We need to build a better world in the aftermath of the pandemic, and understanding these multiple challenges in the justice world and elsewhere is important.
Yeah, and I think that's why the first meeting of the Global Task Force in March, we're going to focus on complex real-world problems, right? Like you cannot just tackle this narrow SAM, but you have to figure out how are they interconnected. And schools at the moment don't tackle it that way, right? Like we learn history, we learn physics, we don't learn all of the interconnections. So a couple of last questions.
Actually, will you allow me to make a small
yes,
to draw a small parallel? We often we often hear that we don't learn how to do taxes in school, but we also don't learn, for example, and this is an interesting example because most countries have this, which are access to information laws or freedom of information laws, as is the case of the United States. And that is as much part of exercising one's civic duties as is casting a ballot in democratic elections. And we don't learn about that either. So there's still quite a bit about areas of justice and transparency. Access to information is vital for that we need to work on.
And even caring about it, right? That this should be something that you care about. So what is one book that we should read to be better human beings? You already gave us one book recommendation, so I'm curious if you have other favorites.
I actually have one favorite that I really, really like. It might be a bit of a difficult read at first because it's so dense, but one of my favorite books, at least over the past few years, has been The Idea of Justice by Amartya Sen. I think that it's a very powerful book to understand the different dimensions of justice. Although interestingly enough, he doesn't actually define justice at any given point in the book, but he does mention different aspects of justice in people's lives. And it might be difficult read at first because it's so dense, but it really flows and is filled with examples from so many different places. And it's exactly why you can it's exactly probably why he got the Nobel Prize at one point.
I have tried to read his books and I have had tough going, but I'm going to try this one. I haven't read this one. Last question, what should we be working on with intention this year?
I think that I'm going to answer that question maybe a little bit more philosophically. I think that we should all, in 2021, make a little bit of effort to, put intentional effort into developing our empathy skills and trying to see the world through someone else's shoes, because this will help us definitely look at different things that we need to be doing to recover better from the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think that is definitely top on my list. And I think reading books is one place to start, but listening, as you said, right, is the second place. So Gilberto, thank you so much for that very, very thoughtful conversation and the advice. And these are very difficult questions, right? And thank you for not shying away from them and giving actual practical advice to educators so that we can go back to students and help them. So thank you. And for everyone else who's watching, we will be back next week with Amir Bani Fatimi. He's from XPRIZE and also leading AI Commons. And we're going to talk about different healthcare solutions that we can be thinking about. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gilberto. Take care.